To continue with the class, I was telling you how several audio-video lessons are available on the YouTube, lessons that you could access for a better understanding of literary criticism and theory. On the screen, as you can see now, I have the YouTube page open before me. I simply typed literary criticism and literary theory and criticism here. You can type literary criticism and theory, literary theory and criticism. And I also added NPTEL. NPTEL or SWAYAM platform will give you access to very standard lessons prepared by on the Government of India mission. So I will slowly scroll down and you will see how so many different lesson recordings are already there. First, what you see here on your screens is literary criticism from Plato to Lewis. This is not one lesson, but if I if I bring my cursor here, you will see how there are in all 54 videos on this topic. Most of these are prepared for the NPTEL by the IIT Madras. Standard lessons available openly for students to even join the course. So you can go to this list. Most of the videos are based on the syllabus that you have. So you will find several topics common to your syllabus and to what is being explained here. Let me scroll down the page a little. We have Introduction to Literary Theory here. This is also an NPTEL lesson. 36 videos available here, prepared by IIT Kanpur faculty. All standard lessons. I'll scroll down a little further. This is a lesson by an IIT faculty, IIT Madras faculty on literary theory and criticism. Here again, if you note down, the complete playlist runs into 43 videos. Then further down, we have Introduction to Peter Barry's. This particular essay is not prescribed for your study. There is another one on EPG Pathshala. This is Literary Criticism and Theory. The course number is also given there, English P10. A little further down is a course on Introduction to Indian Literary Theory. Your syllabus does not talk about Indian literary theory, but currently this particular course is available as a MOOC. The last day to enroll for this course is 19th of August. If you are interested, you may join this course. It is not part of your syllabus though. I scroll further down, there are again various lessons. Introduction to Literary Theory. This was a live session on new criticism theory, bridging structuralism and post-structuralism. One after the other. There are so many lessons that are being shown before you. Let me take you back to the first one that I had shown you. Okay, there is one on Aristotle. I just scrolled and missed it. I could have started from there. Most of these are very, very standard, well-prepared lessons. Okay. This is the one on poetic. This is where we had stopped. I'm playing the video.
Ways, it's also important to note that Aristotle's works and his thought process, his methods, it has also laid the foundations of Western critical thought in ways that no other text has been able to do. And when we talk about the understanding of literature, when we talk about the framing of literature in the Western context, it's always important, and we find that it's always imperative that one begins with Aristotle and about the conception of poetry, tragedy, and rhetoric. This is a text which has assumed more relevance than it had originally did. This is a text of Western critical thought definitions, but we also find that there are certain things which are there in the background informing the understanding of this text, also implying that maybe this was the kind of discussion that they used to have. Maybe this is all framed in a particular way. It's all situated. And at the same time, it's very important to distinguish between life and its representations, life and the way in which it gets imitated.
I'll stop playing the video now. On our slideshow, for poetics, Aristotle talks about the function of tragedy. In the previous slide, we looked at the different elements of tragedy: plot, character, thought, diction, song, and spectacle. Let's look at certain terms that are important in an understanding of Aristotle, especially in an understanding of what Aristotle's tragedy is all about. Terms like catharsis, unity of time, hamartia, climax, catastrophe, or denouement. You can see the meaning in brief listed on your screens on the right hand side. Catharsis is the purgation or the purification of the emotions of pity and fear. Aristotle talks about the three unities: the unity of time, place, and action. The time should be 24 hours according to Aristotle. When a tragedy is written, the entire story, the entire plot should revolve around 24 hours. Otherwise, the audience will be confused. The place should not change. It should remain the same. And the action should be one unified whole. By the time we come to Shakespeare, we notice that Shakespeare has done away with the three unities of time, place, and action. Instead, for Shakespeare, the unity of character is more important. Hamartia is a tragic flaw which leads to the downfall of the tragic hero in a tragedy. Remember, in your earlier semester, you studied King Lear. King Lear is a tragedy. It is one of the great tragedies by Shakespeare. The other four great tragedies by Shakespeare, we have King Lear, Macbeth, Othello, King Lear, Macbeth, Othello, which is the other one, Hamlet. We find that the tragic hero there suffers from a tragic flaw, and this tragic flaw leads to the downfall of that hero. The tragedy has a pyramidical structure. We have the opening scenes which present the rising action. The rising action leads us to the climax. The climax is the turning point. It is where we find the conflict or the tension at the highest point in the entire play. And once the climax is reached, that is where the peak of the pyramid is, then the action begins to fall. We are falling action. There is a catastrophe, something very significant happening in the life of the hero or the other characters, which is extremely tragic, leading to the falling action, and the play ends with the denouement or the final resolution. In general, classical tragedy deals with good and evil, and it aims to present the victory of good over evil. Other things that we learned when we were talking about tragedy in the other semesters was that we also find the presence of the supernatural elements. Sometimes we find the appearance of the deus ex machina, where the gods are brought down on the stage through a contraption. They are lowered to the stage, they come, and then they try to end the whole of the conflict by presenting a resolution or a solution to the entire problem. Because everything cannot be depicted on the stage or theater has its own drawbacks. We also have the presence of the chorus. The chorus, in the form of songs, narrates to us events that take backstage. They tell us about the gaps in the narrative, and they also help in bringing the play closer to the audience. After a study of Plato and Aristotle, we move to the medieval period, where we talk about Thomas Aquinas of the 13th century. Summa Theologica is prescribed for your study and not the entire work. Question 1, Article 9 and Article 10 are prescribed for your study. What does Summa Theologica deal with? It lays down 5 arguments to support the existence of God. The very first bullet point makes it very clear to us that in this work of criticism, the entire thrust is on religion or theology. Aquinas is often described more as a doctor than a critic or a philosopher. In his work, in Summa Theologica, we find a combination of both philosophy and theology. As a staunch Christian, we find Thomas Aquinas remaining steadfast to the Catholic doctrine. What is important in our study of Aquinas is both his life and his religious contribution, because the two are very closely linked to one another. Between the old or the classical period and the modern period, we have Thomas Aquinas and his contribution to medieval criticism bridges the gap between the classical and the modern. He lived around 1225 to 1274 AD. He is often considered to be one of the greatest philosophers of Europe living in the 13th century. He was well versed in both philosophy as well as theology. Like Dante or let us say Michelangelo, Aquinas is also influenced by antiquity, by what comes before him, especially by Aristotle. But what he presents to us is completely different, completely new. At Aquinas, from a religious angle, from a theological lens, it is noticed that Aquinas is at the summit or at the top of the Christian tradition that takes us back to Augustine and to the early establishment of the church. If we look at him as a philosopher, then we can say that Aquinas may be considered to be the founder of the modern philosophical thought. I can find something quickly in your essay. Okay, about his works. If we were to divide his works, we could list them like this in 5 different categories. One are his biblical commentaries, his commentaries on the Bible. So we could say that yes, this is his religious contribution. Then we also have some works which are commentaries on Aristotle and on other philosophical texts. So these are basically philosophical writings. Then he also wrote some very brief works, very short, on being and essence is one such example. Then he also deals with, or his works deal with controversial or disputed questions, such as the questions on truth. And then something more important, what is also prescribed for your study, are his encyclopedic theological treatises, like the one prescribed for your study, that is Summa Theologica. So these are the main works of Aristotle. In general, Summa Theologica, also referred to in short as ST, represents Aquinas' considered thought on a given topic, and it is very, very comprehensive. It runs like an encyclopedia because it contains some discussion on almost all of intellectual concerns that Aquinas felt were important. Generally, it is divided into 4 parts for a better understanding. You do not have the whole of it prescribed for your study, but I'll briefly tell you what each of these parts talk about. In the first part, we learn about the nature of God and about the world created by God, including human nature. The second part deals with human action and what is it that drives human action, for example, virtues and vices, our passions. Then the third part deals with theological and philosophical virtues in elaborate detail. Finally, the last part deals with Christ and the holy books. For Aristotle, the natural reason can prove to us God's existence, that God exists, is truth for Aristotle, and this is something that can be understood by applying our reason. How do we do that? The first step is to show that for everything in the unchangeable world around us, there is a cause. Anything that happens in our life has a cause. This is not just Aquinas speaking several centuries ago, but most other religions also tell us the same thing, that there is a cause for every little thing that happens in the world around us. And this is controlled by none other than the Supreme Creator, God Himself. I think this is about it that we need to know about Aquinas and his contribution. We have run out of time. I'll see if we can take a quick look at Philip Sidney. We can maybe retain our discussion on Dryden for the next class. Sidney's essay, An Apology for Poetry, also known as The Defense of Poetry, is prescribed for your study, where he defends poetry once and then he goes on to talk about imitative poetry. A brief background before we proceed further and end the class. This work, whether you call it The Defense of Poetry or you call it An Apology for Poetry, it is a piece of literary criticism by Philip Sidney, who was basically a poet living during the Elizabethan age. It was first published in the year 1595 after his death posthumously, though it was written about approximately 15 years before that. What was the background to writing this? A playwright, Stephen Gosson, had sharply attacked poetry in a work titled The School of Abuse, and he dedicated this to Sidney. Sidney basically talks about the objections to poetry, and he draws his references from what Plato has said. Remember, in our class earlier, we told how Plato held a very negative view of poetry and how he banished the poets from his Republic. In the essay, An Apology for Poetry, Sidney tries to integrate several classical and Italian precepts on fiction. What his main purpose is in the essay, that poetry, because it combines both history and philosophy, evokes interest in the readers and encourages the readers to lead a life of virtue. So also come to know about Edmund Spenser and about the Elizabethan stage, Elizabethan theatre, or Elizabethan drama. While reacting against the attacks made on poetry by Stephen Gosson, Sidney tells us that poetry is an art of imitation for a specific purpose. The aim of imitation in poetry is to both teach and to delight. So for Sidney, poetry is a means of communication, not just a means of communication, it is a superior means of communication, and the value of poetry depends on what is being communicated or what is it that the poet is trying to convey. So even when history is described in a very lively manner, evoking our passions, then history also becomes poetic. For him, literature that is imaginative is better than history and philosophy because it evokes our interest in it. It makes it more pleasurable reading. Charges that Stephen Gossan had leveled on poetry are that poetry is a waste of time, one. Two, poetry is the mother of lies. And three, it is the nurse of abuse. And he felt that Plato was right when he banished the poets from his republic or the ideal world. Sidney's purpose in the course of this essay is to answer these charges, is to defend poetry against the charges leveled by Gossan. Gossan says that poetry corrupts people, it is a waste of time. But Sidney says that no learning can be as good when it teaches us to move towards virtue, and nothing can do both things, that is, teach and amuse, the way poetry does. He remembers how in the earlier societies, in the Greek societies, people held the poets in great respect. They were looked up to. So how can we now say, in the words of Gossan, that poetry is a waste of time? So Sidney counters Gossan and says that poetry is not a waste of time. About the second charge, when Gossan says that a poet merely tells lies, Sidney counters him by saying that no, the poet does not lie, because he never affirms that what he's saying is the truth. He's simply depicting what he feels, what he experiences, never claiming that what he's saying is the truth. And these poetic truths that the poet tries to depict are ideal and universal. Therefore, he says, we cannot say that poetry is the mother of all lies. The next charge is that poetry is the source of all abuse. To this, Sidney replies that no, it is the people who abuse poetry, not poetry that abuses people. So, also tells us that abuses are also found in philosophy and history and less in poetry, because history talks about battles, about bloodshed, and about violence. So what is more abusive? Is it poetry or is it history? Coming to the charge that Plato has banished or abolished the poets and poetry from his republic, he says that Plato never says that all poets should be banished. He said that only such poets should be banished from his republic who are inferior to others and who are not able to instruct children. So with this, we find that Sidney has answered all the charges leveled against poetry by Gossan. He also goes on to tell us that art is an imitation of nature, but it is not a blind imitation like Plato believes. It is creative imagination. Nature may be dull and incomplete and ugly. It is the poet who turns it into something that is beautiful, aesthetic. Take, for example, A Field of Daffodils by Wordsworth. In itself, that field of daffodils may not hold much weight, but the way Wordsworth has described the field of daffodils has made it so much more beautiful to the listeners, to the readers. So, in keeping with the Renaissance tendency, Sidney says that the purpose of art is to teach as well as to delight. With this, I think we could close the class for today. When we meet later on, we will have a look at other part that you see on your screen here, John Dryden's An Essay on Dramatic Poesy, and we'll go on to talk about the other important topics from your syllabus. We have only about